Okay, and welcome back to the closing session of the Bristol Poverty Institute's Conference on Poverty and the SDGs. This is the 6th Peter Townsend Memorial Conference. I am David Gordon, as many of you already know, and I'll be chairing this session today. My co-chair for this session is Lauren Winch, the manager of the Bristol Poverty Institute. Before I introduce the three fabulous speakers we have today, I just want to give the usual words of housekeeping. This session is going to be recorded and posted on the YouTube platform of the Bristol Poverty Institute and on the website. So by attending, you're giving consent to being part of this recording. Please can I ask you to add your names as you come into this session so that when you ask questions, we'll be able to say who you are to the speakers. You'll be able to ask questions via the Zoom Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screens. But due to time constraints, we may or may not be able to answer all the possible questions you're likely to ask, because I think this session is going to generate quite a lot of interest. Please note the chat function will not be available, so please use the Q&A function to ask questions. And of course, please be respectful to the speakers during this event. So this session is going to be on building back fairer. We have three wonderful speakers for you this afternoon, and I'm also going to say a few words at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce the first speaker, who is Dr. Dominic Richardson. Dominic is Chief of Social and Economic Analyses at the UNICEF Office of Research, where he oversees work on a range of subjects, including work on cash transfers and cash programs in sub-Saharan Africa, deprivation analyses, the report card series, and research on family policies and child well-being. Before starting this job at UNICEF, Dominic previously worked at the OECD in the Social Policy Division. So basically, Dominic's gone from working in a large palace in Paris to a slightly smaller palace in Florence. It's a tough job, but someone's got to do it. He has published numerous important reports and led many important projects. And in 2018, he was awarded the Jan Trost Lifetime Achievement Award for his outstanding contribution in international family studies by the National Council for Family Relations in the United States. And he's going to talk this afternoon about supporting families and children post-COVID-19 and learning from previous crises on how to build back fairer. Dominic, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dave, and it's really great to be able to talk to you today about the work we've been doing and what we've been learning at UNICEF globally about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and what we think this means for building back fairer. I'm going to share my screen and get my slides up. I hope this works without doing that thing with the two little. Dave, can you just tell me whether that...
That's great, I can see them fine. I can also see your notes.
Yeah, has it gone full screen yet?
No.
There we are, wonderful. All right, thank you. There's quite a lot to get through, so I'm gonna try and be quick. I mean, I'll start with the key messages. I suppose when COVID hit, when we realized it was going to be a long-lasting problem that was touching countries all over the world, and particularly sensitive maybe because we were based in the north of Italy and saw the very first sort of troubles hitting quite deeply in Europe. We, as an office, thought, well, what can we do to help things in these conditions? And our first thought was to learn from crises gone past. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what we learned from a review of 20 years of responses to crises, both in terms of fiscal stimulus and social protection policies from all around the world. The joint learning has shown that the crisis, like pretty much every crisis, is a story of inequality, both locally, nationally, and globally. The inequality before the crisis, before a crisis and a pandemic, it can contribute to the resilience to the crisis. The responses to the crisis can contribute to inequality in the immediate term. As we all know, we don't grow equally as countries, nations, wherever we are, we grow unequally. So as we rebound from the crisis, inequality will be accentuated. I'm going to show you a bit about that. We also didn't want people to take their eyes off the SDGs, and this is what you're doing too, so I won't elaborate on that. Our evidence suggests that the balance of fiscal stimulus to social protection is way off. Some countries around the world prior to the crisis were spending 3 times on debt service, just the interest, than they were on their entire social protection, education and health systems combined. I've put there prepare for the long term. I think what the job ahead of us to address poverty globally and inequality globally is going to be much beyond the 2030 deadline of the SDGs. I think there's some very basic issues that we need to address to start with. But there's silver linings to clouds like COVID, and there's a changing discourse. Particularly we're seeing in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, a change in the discourse around the determinants of poverty and the personalization of poverty, because the effect is from the, let's say, the very outside of the socio-ecological model. So our review looked at crises and disasters, and you'll see them on there. We were as global as we could be. We also looked at HIV and AIDS. We separated 2 streams of evidence that we could find on the economic policy, was the economic stimulus, business grants, relief, tax relief and bills, etc., which can go straight to businesses, as you'll know. And then the social protection responses from social insurance assistance, jobs programs, and social services. We found actually 132 studies in total that we could use, both quantitative and qualitative. And as I say, it was 20 years, and we didn't just look at published articles, but into grey literature as well. The outcomes, how we organized our outcomes, our learning from this, we're into these domains of economic security, work, health, education, and safety. The particular indicators that fell under each of those categories are there, because I'm about to summarize the evidence, so I'll keep moving quickly. We were interested, using this work, to see whether there were some promising practices or standards and practices that we could find consistently good evidence that they worked for addressing the needs of children and families post-health pandemic or an economic crisis. And this is what we found overall. If you read this slide on the left-hand side, let's say the y-axis of the matrix, you can see we've split the findings into fiscal measures, social insurance, and social assistance, essentially, tax-financed interventions, which are direct to individuals or services delivered directly to individuals. The fiscal stimulus is primarily interventions to stimulate the economy. We also included evidence on austerity, and from across the top, you can see that we've got those outcomes that I mentioned before, left to right. Now it's just a red, amber, green Green means good, red means bad. And a couple of important messages from what we could learn from previous crises was that stimulus did have an effect on income. It had mixed effects on work. Austerity is bad news across the board. We find effects of children not being enrolled in school, increases in domestic violence and suicide. In the social insurance side of things, they kind of do what they're designed to do. Health insurance affecting health, and the unemployment insurance and weather insurance, helping those with income and economic impacts. Again, the effects of work were mixed. But the real payoff we found was in the social assistance side, particularly around cash transfers and school feeding. These were positive for the outcomes where we had the evidence in terms of achieving what we would hope would protect families during a crisis. So you can read it there. Now, why we'd published that before we started to do the next level of work. I mean, there's some things I wanted to say about that actually. There was global differences naturally in the responses to crises in the past. In high-income countries, there was strong fiscal stimulus, followed by austerity. In low-income countries, there was temporary interventions, more temporary than you'd see in high-income countries. And there was inequalities in how some of these things were delivered. Some of the services resulted in different effects for boys and girls in labour market entry. And indeed in fiscal stimulus straight to business support, some of them went into male-dominated industries. Which had those effects. But generally, responses to crises have been one-off. The weak social protection systems were an issue for whether or not these responses would be high or low. I understand that if a system is resilient to a crisis, we're not going to see shock response in the way we might see in countries which are less resilient. Take the Nordic response compared to perhaps the United States. And the inequality increased. Our next pieces of work then were to say, well, okay, if that's what's good, if these are the things we'd expect to see under the conditions that were there before, how do the conditions compare now, and what are governments doing to give us a reassurance that it's going to be successful or not? So we looked at some trends and things right early beyond the 2007-8 financial crisis. And we looked at 3 regions: West Africa, Central and Eastern Europe, and high-income countries. This is the high-income countries one. That's GDP. People like to talk about the growth GDP, but we think actually per capita GDP is more important. The dip in growth, and we've seen what 10% in the UK, and I'll show you what's happening in Africa in a minute, can be one-off, but the repercussions can be long-term. In the case of the United Kingdom, you can see the 2007 GDP per capita had not recovered 10 years after the crisis, and that's not uncommon. In West and Central Africa, we were looking at the same because we wanted to understand how the responses were going there. You can see the GDP and the per capita rates pre-crisis on the left, and you can see what happened at the global financial crisis, which did affect West Africa. It lowered the growth rates. It didn't end up in the negative way in the same we see in other countries, in other regions. But there was also a commodity crisis in 2014, which we could look at and see what happened, and that was more severe. The predictions, according to the World Bank, the economic contraction related to COVID, as you can see, is completely the other way. It's not as deep as we see in places like that in the high-income countries, but for vulnerable countries with weaker systems, this is serious in terms of its contraction. I'll show you what this means. So we looked then, we sort of compiled all of those trends, economic trends, social trends, along with trends on the outcomes that we were interested in from 2003 onwards, and we studied them by region using macro-pool time series, and the outcomes were all related to the SDGs. These are the high-income country ones. This is, let's say, the pre-COVID baseline for the United Kingdom. what we found, this is a lagged macro pool time series study. According to contractions in GDP per capita over high income countries, mostly European because of data constraints, that a 1 standard deviation change, a drop in GDP per capita, and we saw much more than that in many countries, results in a 3% change on the average poverty rate the year later. So we expect poverty to increase. It's less than 1% on the average in Europe, but the concern is that some countries experience much deeper falls. And the second concern is that poverty risk, you see the confidence interval on that chart on the left, doesn't cross 0 after 5 years, and so the poverty risk is sustained. We show here that various, if you look at the little orange bars there, these are again macro pool time series. On the other outcomes, you can see that some of the effects on the other outcomes children experience are rooted through the poverty risk, like the mortality rates, and some of them are related directly to the fall in GDP per capita. And we can look at the protective effects of expenditures in the green bars. In West Africa, we look particularly at immunizations. These 2 bars that are dropping below 0 show the effects on the take-up of immunizations in the West African region around the times of the crises. And we can see that they fell much more under the commodity crisis, which was a bigger crush, but they did also fall using the same methods. They did also fall after the global financial crisis. That was immunizations, but in Africa too, the adolescent fertility rate increased and the primary school completion rate fell really quite severely. And I heard some of the lessons on education before, and its use for addressing poverty. We're creating scarring effects if we don't address these responses to the crisis. This picture shows the number. This is the 100% of children in each country that would not receive a DPT immunization. Using the elasticities from our work, we can calculate what proportion of that missing a number of children from 2020 are missing because of the crisis, the reductions in wealth, both at the household level and the system level, that create a breakdown in the delivery of immunizations. Those numbers combined, we estimate approximately 870,000 West African babies born last year will not receive their DPT immunization. So we've looked at a couple of things and, what the expectations are for the SDGs, but, what does this mean? How did governments respond? This is a study I did with the World Bank, looking at the first 18 months of the global financial crisis compared to the first 7 months of the response to COVID. The range is the range in countries, the same 49 countries. We looked at the volume of the fiscal stimulus response, how much they spent in terms of GDP. And it ranged, you can see around an average of 4, ranged between 0.2 to 20% in the global, and that's after 18 months. In approximately less than almost a year, 12 months less, the countries were already doubled the average. And that 42% is Japan, and that's committed. It's not yet spent, but it's earmarked for it. In terms of not just spending, the country's not only spending more, but they're spending it. They've continued, let's say, the austerity, so the stimulus for longer, but how they've spent it is a real issue, but particularly for families and children. This chart I won't labor, but the big proportion of direct to family interventions, this doesn't include the fiscal stimulus, were not child specific. And according to our literature review, we'd be looking to see more direct to family for support of children interventions, particularly when we're looking at trying to stifle or stop the fall in the SDG, child-focused SDG targets. Looking at high-income countries and their spending, and why I say we really need to rebalance, is those red boxes tell you something. This is the first 6 months, 41 countries. Of 341 responses, 47 were child or family specific, 182 were fiscal stimulus. Now remember the chart at the beginning about what works. And that's over 90% of the entire expenditure going direct to business. Yes, it trickles down, but it starts in the hands of businesses. Only 2.3% starts in the hands of families, and that's of a projected $11 trillion spent in the first 6 months. Now we talk about expensive interventions. $11 trillion is about 10% of global GDP. In West Africa, there's fewer policies, but also the picture that we can see for support for children is similar, though child nutrition and feeding is probably more prevalent considering the number of countries that compared between the two groups. What was interesting was informal sectors in intervention, which informal work remains to be a problem in many high-income countries, and there was very little effort to deal with that. In fact, most of the interventions required previous employment or benefit receipt. So near poor or people loosely attached to the labour market didn't benefit from that, which as much as others, creating inequality and high poverty risks. Last couple of slides. I told you about how much was spent in high-income countries. It's harder to say what was spent in low-income countries, but I do want to talk about debt because I mentioned earlier that some countries, these top 10 countries in terms of debt servicing, where they spend at least twice as much as they do on debt servicing as they do on expenditures in social protection, health and education combined. If we're going to come up with excellent policy ideas, and I talk about education being the route out of poverty or the need for ensuring that children have healthy starts, there's a global effort should be made to extend the relief for these countries and indeed debt forgiveness. That could go with ODA as well. So what do policymakers need to do? I believe there's a change in the discourse on poverty, depersonalization of poverty, and they should Joe Biden the problem and jump on board. Big change. I think they've taken advantage of that in the US, I really do. The 92 to 2% balance is not evidence informed and requires change. We need to address debt and low expenditures. You go to a country like Ghana when a child is 13, we're talking about $600 a year is invested on that child. In the US, it's 16,000. We really have to consider the low expenditures are crippling countries' ability to enact any meaningful policy. We should have set conditions on stimulus the way we set conditions on benefits. It's public money after all. And then there's some other things that are there, which you heard me say over the time, but the big concern for me, and I know that people will say that debt is affordable now, but debt will not always be affordable. And austerity is on the horizon. And knowing that the whole story of the crisis is an inequality on inequality on inequality, austerity would be the cherry on the very unhappy cake. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic. I'm going to take questions at the end, so I'll move on to our next speaker, who I'm delighted to welcome back, Professor Luis Bacalia. I think it's entirely fair to say that there is no one who knows more about poverty in Latin America than Professor Bacalia. He is currently the Senior Research Officer at the University of General Sacramento in Argentina, but he has held many important jobs in the past. He studied for his PhD at the University of Cambridge and with the Nobel laureate, Professor Richard Stone, as his supervisor. And then he worked with Altamir on developing poverty and unmet basic needs measures across Latin America. He was professor at the University of Buenos Aires. He was director of the National Statistical Office of Argentina, and he was director of the Statistical Division of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America, where he did some of the world-leading research on measuring poverty and unmet basic needs. He was previously head of the research unit at the National Development Bank and has been a consultant to many national and international organizations and governments. His main areas of interest are labour economics, income distribution, poverty and poverty measurement. And he was the joint inventor of the combined low income and unmet basic needs poverty measure in Latin America with his co-worker, Professor Alberto Minuchin. Professor Beccario is going to talk about facing poverty in post-pandemic Latin America. Professor Beccario, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you for inviting me to this important meeting. I'm delighted to share with our distinguished colleague the floor. Latin American face traditionally challenge for reducing deprivation and inequalities in several economic and social dimensions, and in the root of these problems are the structural characteristics of their economy, and particularly of their labor market. But also the social protection in these countries has been unable to cope with this complex panorama that derive from these structural characteristics. On top of that, the pandemic has a very harsh impact on the region, even more than in other areas, if we, at least in the short term, if we look, for example, at the falling GDP, it was of the largest region in the world, and it's as expected, that has been frequently discussed in this conference, has a very negative impact on living condition, on a large proportion of the population, increasing poverty and inequality even more. As mentioned Dave in his presentation on Tuesday, on the first day, those already facing the worst living condition were the most affected, and also just now Dominique make a point on that. Consequently, the effect of the pandemic make even more pressing for the region to define strategies to reduce poverty. It should be remembered that Latin America is the most unequal region of the world according to income distribution. We look at money, this is the larger inequality, not necessarily in the region with the greatest level of poverty, but a larger level of poverty, but it's more unequal, more income unequal distribution. And there are also very significant, very important gaps regarding health, education, housing, basic service. Although there are very important differences among countries, but in general, this a large proportion of population lacking adequate access to this service. In fact, poverty has been declined over the first 15 years of the century, but 3, 4, or 5 years before the pandemic, it stopped this reduction, and even in some countries, it began to grow. So the situation at the moment of the eruption of the pandemic, the social, the economic, and the social situation was worse than in the first decade. Given this context, what I will be in this very brief presentation, some ideas concerning anti-poverty policies in Latin America for the next year, how to recover from the pandemic, and how to some thought of how to go on more appropriate policies. But will be necessary very general in my presentation. but I try to highlight some main shortcomings that characterize what is going on with intervention in social areas in the region. For example, the lack of adequate integration among these policies, which have characterized after poverty policy. And will at the end make a specific point that is also concerning with this issue, but refer to multidimensional poverty measure, which is a necessary instrument to monitor anti-poverty policies, because a few countries in the region have some experience on this type of measure. And in particular, I briefly comment on a recent experience in Argentina that take into account the consensual approach based on towns and relative poverty, and which received support from Dave and his colleague. This strong impact on the pandemic on main developing countries, including in Argentina, recently was already mentioned, partly result from the characteristic of the labor market. I can insist on that, as the lockdown measures particularly affected informal activities. Large proportion of on-account workers were prevented from going on working, at least initially, and employers rapidly dismissed those informal wage earners not covered by regular labor protection and especially dismissal regulation. The fall of aggregate incomes derived from this loss of jobs were very important, and in fact become another source of reduction in aggregate demand, reduction in GDP, was a compounding factor. So the most intense impact on those already most vulnerable part of the population, those already receiving the lower earnings, and those being less protected by the social security system. They not even benefit from some policies that at the first moment was implemented in the countries directed to retain workers, which will allow a relative reduction. Informal employment in the region fall relatively quite low, and in part was due to these transfers of these subsidies directed to formal employment. As said, it is required to deploy policies directed to recover the loss already suffered from the beginning of the last year, and those that it is expected to be faced during this year, as probably you know, the number of new cases with COVID is reaching very high levels now in the region, and the probably new lockdown measure will be needed for a large part of the year. So it is needed. The problem is that what you need very quickly to promote the rapid recovery of growth, because employment will become again a major source of difficulties and complicate the already difficult situation. But it is of high priority to design new and reinforce specific anti-poverty policies to address those traditional challenges that become even more pressing in this moment. In society that of the Latin American country, with half of the labor force made up of informal workers, whose earnings are on average very low, many of those earning less than the formal worker minimum wage, which in these countries are actually very low, and are not insured against unemployment. An important component of anti-poverty strategy are cash transfer programs to those not covered by the contributory social security. There are several programs of these types in the region, dating back some years now, in some countries 20 years, some of them having a large coverage. But even in this case, the pandemic made it clear the need to extend those programs, as there are still large proportion of poor and vulnerable households not covered by them. there are precisely those this which are not covered by the cash transfer are even among those with more difficulties, as they don't have adequate mechanisms to face shocks, even shocks less intense than the one derived from the pandemic. There is also a need to increase the amount of the transfer. This was also done transitorily during the pandemic, and particularly for households with children, which are facing the more important difficulties. There is also a need to reform some of the characteristics of this cash transfer program, for example, combining them with action directed to improve employment of those in this group, being training, being specific employment subsidies. However, advances toward reducing poverty in all dimensions and empowering the poor against the many risks they face, and to lower the chance of poverty reproduction requires policies in a wider range of areas, as it was made clear by different presentations during the conference, and as implicit and said in the Dominic also presented very clear presentation made just before me. Increasing the access to good quality education has been shown as a priority during the pandemic. Many countries have advanced during many countries in the region have advanced during the last decades in reducing inequality in access, but still important challenge remain regarding disparities in permanence and in the quality of learning. Again, the pandemic made it even more clear how poor children, but also many of those of low to middle income households, have suffered from trying to adapt to the circumstances demanded by the pandemic, increasing those already existing gaps. The figure on the proportion of children, mainly of secondary education age, of low-income families that left school last year are staggering in some countries, and the probability of them coming back are not great. Apart from the specific strategy to improve the quality of education received by low-income children, expanding digital connection is crucial, not just in the school, but for ensuring the access to good connection for the household. Health is another area showing important inequality, as the lack of access to reasonable good service by the poor is also a main feature of social deprivation in the region. But much has been said during the conference, and Professor Heyman is going to address some aspect of this question. Improving housing and environment conditions together with expanding basic service is a main pillar of anti-poverty strategy, given the externalities on the quality of life. As frequently indicated, this component has also the advantage of promoting the employment of especially low-skilled workers, precisely those more hit by the pandemic and the lockdowns. Latin American countries traditionally have policies in this and other areas, but perhaps one of the main difficulties facing anti-poverty policies in the region is the segmentation of the different efforts. They are carried out by different governmental institutions which do not coordinate among themselves, and perhaps more important difficulty, they don't share a clear view on the causes, or the same view on the causes of poverty and how it reproduces. This situation derives in the waste of resources and the difficulties of taking advantage of the synergies among coordinated action in different fields. The difficulties even occur within each area, as for example, different policies on education may also be designed and or implemented without the necessary coordination. So the challenge facing by these countries, not just to recover from the specific impact of the pandemic, are very important, but the institutional network that need to be implement them is in many countries still very weak, notwithstanding some advance made during the last years. Let me finish the first part stressing an obvious point that it will be very difficult that any anti-poverty strategy will be sustained, and more important, will have significant impacts without a process of economic growth and formal labor demand. But as growth by itself is not enough, given the important level of poverty in different dimensions. There is a need, on the one hand, to consider growth strategies that take into account macroeconomic criteria, particularly necessary in a region with traditionally high income instability, but also to promote this strategy has to take into account as a main objective to promote employment and to have the possibility of promoting low skill work. But on the other hand, this growth policy has to articulate with strategies, anti-poverty specific anti-poverty policies as those indicated. The first 15 years of the century in Latin America show an example of some improvement regarding this approach, but also it shows some of its limitations. During this period, many Latin American countries has a process of sustained and relatively high economic growth. And this was accompanied by an improvement in the quality of employment. It was a reduction in the rate of informal workers. And income poverty also came down to certain extent. And it was due not just because of this process of high growth, which was a necessary condition, obviously, but also because specific policies were put into practice, both to reduce informality and to reduce at least income policy. But on the other hand, advances in other areas, the one I mentioned, education, housing, health, was less important because their policies were not in accordance with the general objective of reducing poverty in their multiple dimensions. Allow me to turn now to the second part of the presentation I indicated, which relate to the question of anti-poverty policies and how to do with the necessary instrument required to monitor, or one of the necessary instruments required to monitor the situation, which is the multidimensional poverty indicator, multidimensional poverty measure. Latin America has a long tradition in income poverty measure. And presently, practically all countries in the region have their own official measure of income poverty. However, regarding multidimensional approach, there was an experience in the 80s where some countries developed their measure, but was mainly used with data from the population census. And only recently, some countries began to work on new approaches to multidimensional poverty, but there are very few, these countries are very few, less those that have regular and official measure of multidimensional poverty. And there is therefore a need to extend the production of this indicator throughout the region. But moreover, many of those experiences face some difficulties that unfortunately we can't discuss here, but these difficulties and shortcomings mainly come from the lack of a clear conceptual framework, scarce effort, few effort made to produce specific basic data to evaluate deprivation in certain areas. They are regularly estimated using existing indicators that are already in their regular surveys, and they lack statistical analysis on dimensional as validity on reliability. Professor Gordon, for example, has analyzed one experience in the region, making it clear which are some of the weakness that the difficulties that face this measure. Precisely the consensual approach developed by Professor Gordon and his colleague here at Bristol, based on the Townsend perspective on relative poverty, appear as an alternative that could be employed, and I'm sure it could be employed, to increase and improve the production of multidimensional indicators, which will become critical to monitor anti-poverty measures. I was involved in a recent experience carried out by the government of the city of Buenos Aires using this approach. This was an excellent experience, which we received the support of the Bristol University and specifically the Professor Gordon and his colleague. And it showed all its potentialities for being an adequate instrument for countries in the region, and which can be administered with the regular households that exist in the region, and that produce a very sensitive indicator. The city of Buenos Aires already make it clear that will include this measure as a regular one in his battery of poverty measures. The city of Buenos Aires already has its monetary based poverty measure, and it's going to combine them or not, or to present separately, but already has, as I said, decided to go on with this mention. So there is a pressing need in the region to go on with this kind of measure, given the necessary requirement for adequate monitoring of anti-poverty policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Beccaria. That was an excellent talk. If people want to put questions in the Q&A, we'll take them at the end of after Professor Heyman's final talk. But so you can put them at any time into the Q&A. Okay, our last speaker today, but not least, is Professor Jodie Heyman. She is the founding director of the World Policy Analysis Center and professor, and was previously dean at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. Jodie and her team have for decades been trying to harmonize the social policies of every country on the planet. This is a task which makes the labours of Hercules seem easy. And it's been a massive effort. Before moving to the University of California, Professor Heyman held the Canadian Research Chair in Global Health and Social Policy at McGill University. And prior to that, she worked at the Harvard Medical School and the Harvard School for Public Health, where she founded the project on global working families. She has over 400 publications, including 18 books. I'm not going to try and read through all of them, as well that would take a very long time, but most recently she's published a book for the University of California Press on advancing equality. Other major books have been Changing Children's Chances and Making Equal Rights Real. She has received numerous honours, including election to the National Institute of Medicine in 2013 in the USA and to the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences in 2012. and she's worked with international organizations and leaders and NGOs and governments across the world. The floor is yours, Jodie. She's going to talk about addressing health and economic inequalities, the critical role of paid sick leave amidst the pandemic and beyond. Jodie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dave, for that generous introduction. And thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. Dominic and Luis have just given this incredibly compelling picture, each of them in different ways, of the breadth of what needs to be done to change on our social protection floor, to change inequality, to change poverty. I believe in that broad vision they both shared. And I'm going to argue that we need to spend some of our time and energy, maybe a lot, focusing in on one key area of social protection, paid sick leave, and that builds on what Dominic found in terms of the role of social protection. It also builds on much of what Luis said about the importance of understanding who's particularly vulnerable in the informal economy and the importance of work. So let me take a minute here to share my screen. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see the slides now, and if you can't, someone should unmute and give a shout. Otherwise, I'll assume you can. So why paid sick leave? It's really easy to list a bunch of health benefits and a bunch of economic benefits to it, but I do want to give everyone more of a visceral sense of what this means outside of pandemics, and then talk about why we need it post-pandemic, or should have had it pre-pandemic. So one of the largest causes for people who are not in poverty already to drop into poverty are major illnesses of a worker in the family, or major illness of a child that they are funding the cost of. For those who are already in poverty, the impact on landing in extreme poverty or worsening. So how does this work? People lose employment, they lose their jobs. If they're in the informal economy, they lose their ability to make an earning in the way they are, and they lose wealth. So whatever limited wealth there is, whatever savings, the less savings you have, the greater the impact it's dived into in the absence of paid sick leave. So we know this on an individual level, but we also know it actually using national data on countries. You can study exits from poverty and re-entry into poverty or falling deeper into poverty, and illness is one of the major causes. The great news is there is an instrument for this. Now, of all times, we should be aware of its power. That's paid sick leave. I think too often people think of this as only being about the formal economy. There is no reason this can't reach the informal economy, and I'll be talking about that. I just want to make two more points before I dive into looking at where are we in the world on this. Pandemics. Who has gotten sick in countries? So everybody's been at risk of getting COVID, but not everybody has gotten sick equally. Marginalized groups that are marginalized in terms of income, in terms of race, are more likely in terms of migration, in terms of incarceration, are more likely to get sick. A big piece of that is exposure, but also groups that are marginalized, poorer workers, racial and ethnic minorities, workers who are new to the workforce, those who are in jobs that turn over often are less likely to be covered by sick leave. So what did we do? We looked, as Dave said, we tend to want to look at all countries. We have looked at all countries in the world, 193 UN countries, to look at leave availability. And then we've looked at the nitty-gritty. So I hope you'll take this talk as just one example of diving into the nitty-gritty, into a crucial area, but something we need to do for each of these areas, because passing a policy but not making sure it covers everybody most commonly leaves the most vulnerable out, and we'll see that in sick leave. So what's the state of the world? This just looks at who has paid sick leave from the first day of illness. Well, why would we care about that? We care about that because there are many policies that say, well, you have to wait a week before you get paid sick leave. The problem with that is whether it's in a pandemic year, SARS-1, SARS-CoV-2, MERS, the next pandemic, H1N1 or others, if you have to go to work when you're sick for a week, you have already spread it. Outside of pandemics, every year, hundreds of thousands of people die from influenza. Again, if you go to work, if you don't have sick leave from the first day, you will go to work sick. What we see in this map is sort of good news, bad news. A lot of countries, if they provide it, those are the green ones, do provide it from the first day, but I'm going to show in a minute that not everybody gets that leave. But some of the countries worst hit don't have paid sick leave, and that's not a coincidence. So which are the countries with none whatsoever? The United States, one of the worst pandemics. Is this just an association? No, in fact, there was a study already done showing that when temporary paid sick leave was passed, spread of COVID went down. The problem is that's too late. We need to prevent pandemics if we care about the resulting poverty, inequality, and deaths. We have to prevent them first. Sick leave needs to be in place all the time, before, during, and after. Another hard-hit country, India, you can see without it. We started early on talking about how Italy got hit hard in Europe. Just look at the European countries across that don't have paid sick leave from the first day. It's not enough just to have it from the first day. There needs to be enough time. We looked at 2 weeks or more. 2 weeks is what was commonly being asked of people to stay home with COVID, but it wouldn't be uncommon for other serious infectious diseases. And certainly it's far too short for the kind of major illness that often lands people in poverty, cancer, serious cardiac events, et cetera. And you can see that map that looked like much of the world provide paid sick leave. When you look at how many provide at least 2 weeks and from the first day, the number goes down further. Now, I'd say keep your eye on places like Africa that look good for now, because we're going to talk in a minute about who's covered. So the self-employed, and we all know that in many countries, the self-employed are a large number. There is a good news, bad news picture here. So the good news is there are models in low, middle, and high-income countries for providing sick leave to the self-employed and to the informal economy. But it is an enormous gap, and that's just what the first part of this chart shows. Only 7% of low-income countries covering it, and only 38% of middle income, and even in high-income countries, a third of them not covering the self-employed. So when you map that in regions, and this is why I had looked at Africa before, that look good on other measures, the problem is the lack of coverage. ones that look pretty good on covering the self-employed, like Europe, we saw before, however, weren't giving 2 weeks from the first day, still big gaps in coverage. If you look more comprehensively and say, is there coverage for self-employed, part-time, and recently hired workers, the numbers of countries doing this get even less. So again, bringing us back to why do we have to care about this? There have been 4 major respiratory pandemics in the past 20 years. This is not our last. We need to worry not only about how do we recover from this, but how do we prevent the next one? Because we can't afford, in terms of economies overall, in terms of inequality or poverty, to have these series of major crises. There are a number of things we have to do to prevent future ones, but one piece of that is the ability of everyone to take that basic measure, if you're sick, of being able to stay home and not spread disease. So I think a lot of times high income countries feel like, well, okay, that's a problem over there, but we do a good job. Unfortunately, buried in the details, though, are large gaps in who's covered. This looks at, it's going to sound wonkish, but it turns out to be a major issue, tenure requirements. So what happens if you say, well, you don't get your sick leave till you've worked 3 months, 6 months, a year? And it looks at how many people by age group in each of these countries in the OECD that we've selected actually meet the tenure requirements. And what you see consistently is that young adults have very high rates of not meeting the tenure requirements that needed to get full sick leave. France, it's nearly half. Australia, it's over 1/3 of 20 to 24-year-olds. These are very high numbers of people with inadequate coverage, and a group that is a big part of spread in many countries. We also have to worry about whether what you get, the wage replacement rate, so how much money you get while you're on sick leave, is enough to get you out of poverty. Here we use as a poverty measure 50% of the national median income. Even average wage earners, a significant number, are dropped into poverty. This is, you can take as an example, week 1, half of average wage earners are getting a poverty level wage replacement rate. Week 3, 32%. But where the numbers are really astronomical is in minimum wage earners. So minimum wage earners are consistently being dropped in the OECD into poverty while they're receiving sick leave. So I'm going to close because I'm so eager for the discussion, but I just wanted to throw up quickly that while we think this is a really crucial area for social protection, we do global work across areas, income, childhood, families, environment, child marriage, child labor, many adult labor, non-discrimination areas. All of our data is free and public use at worldpolicycenter.org. Our notion is that the basic legal rights need to be in place, the policies need to be in place that advance equality, and we have to measure whether they work, we have to measure if they're implemented, and that doing this absolutely requires partnerships. So we have a dedicated area on our website about how we can partner, and if anybody's interested in partnering, please don't hesitate to reach out. I look forward to our discussion together.
Thank you, Jody, for that fantastic talk. Can I ask the speakers to turn their videos and mics back on? And please, can I ask the participants to post any questions they may have in the Q&A? So the first question we have is from Amal Kawakai, who's asked, there should be systems to make policymakers accountable in the light of unacceptable levels of corruption in some countries in Africa and other developing countries elsewhere. How could this be done? Yeah. Do any of the speakers want to talk about how you make get leaders accountable to the population, and particularly when it comes to corruption, and how this could help in building back fairness?
I'll just mention one thing and then turn it to Dominic and Luis. The one thing I want to say is there is corruption in all our countries. So this is not limited to one region or one continent or one set of countries. You know, when you follow military contracts in the United States and who they go to, when you follow finance trains in Europe and elsewhere, I think there is not a part of the world where we can't find it. I think the accountability is really important. And there have been a number of mechanisms for financial accountability. I do also think we have to hold leaders accountable for the policies they pass and where they implement them well and who they cover, which is part of why we're trying to map and make transparent and accessible on people's phones what actions countries can take and how they compare to their neighbors.
I couldn't agree more there. In Europe, the leaders of Israel and Portugal are currently under police investigation, and there's an investigation about to start of the UK Prime Minister as well. Dominic, Luis, do you want to address it?
I think, Joe, oh, sorry, Luis, please go ahead.
No, go ahead.
That'd be quite. I think that the Jody's comments again. I totally agree. There's corruption everywhere. It's funny. Right at the beginning of my career, the UK government wanted to do a study on benefit take-up. So you take it from the country to the individual level, and it was initially called. I wasn't working on it, but my colleagues were, called the fraud and error project. And it turned out that, well, after a little while, they called it just the error project. So overstated the issue of fraud as being the problem, and rather just the basic problems with the system. And I think there's some systems issues here. When I raised the issue related to debt servicing and investment, I really did not want it to be an issue, you know, like the poorest countries are where the problem sits. It's a global issue. And then there's, of course, functioning democracy, which should do something for dealing with fraud, if we're going to talk about that too. Over to Luis.
Thank you. Yes, at least in Latin America and in some countries, as far as I know, there has some advance in the putting up a formal mechanism against corruption. Also, and at least some advance has been made, but the problem is with enforcing sometimes these formal institutions. You can find in some countries that they create what is called an anti-corruption office, but this depends from the government, and the guy who is on this office is from the government. So even though there has been some advantage, some country has put against has presidents and very important figures. The government has to respond against the justice. So some advance, but I think we feel it's still very little this advance. It depends on the country, but it was very little. But at least there has been a lot of discussion about this issue, and it's an issue of discussion in Latin America.
Okay, there's some questions to individual speakers. So I'll take Dominic first since he started. You showed that 11 trillion, which is an amazing amount, is being spent on stimulus and pandemic policies, of which 92% is going to business and only 2.3% to children and families. So the question was, what percentage do you think should go to, what should the balance be, ideally? Who's got it right, and what would the balance be?
Well, that's a very tough question. But I mean, I think we're safe on the ground to say we're safe with the argument that that present balance is a bit too heavily in favor of one way. Let's draw from what Louise and Jody have said about, you know, using existing systems to distribute the funds and what that might do to inequality through the social protection side. So if we were to load that side up with money, there's still going to be inequality. So we have to think about that country by country. It should be different. In fact, maybe it's policy reform, not additional spending we need to think of. And on the business side, we also have we go back to the issue of corruption, misspending, and essentially it's trickle down shock response. And you know that what people think of trickle down approaches to welfare, because essentially it is a welfare intervention. So yes, I don't really know, but I would say, well, the evidence points towards a much stronger role for social protection. But we can't sort of forget that it's not just how much you spend in either stream, it's how you spend it to make sure you're not missing the most vulnerable populations. Thanks.
Another question just comes through in the Q&A, which is, how would the speakers define fairness? This seems to be absent in their presentations. Jody, do you want to start?
So, you know, I don't think there is one approach to this. So what I'm about to describe is just what my personal goal would be and what I believe is achievable right now, which is making everyone better off, but making the poorest and most marginalized the most better off. So basically leveling up. And I think that's achievable. I think sick leave is an example of that. I think it's an example because everybody's infection rates will be lower if everyone had sick leave, not just in a pandemic year, but in other years, there'd be less spread of gastroenteritis and influenza and many illnesses. But because those who are most exposed to illness and least able to take time tend to be the poorest and most marginalized, it would disproportionately benefit those who are worst off right now. So that's an example. And I would be looking, whether it's in a social protection like paid sick leave, or whether it's in a way we're improving education in schools and early childhood, for approaches, again, that have wide benefit across everyone and have the greatest benefit where the need is greatest.
Reese, do you want to respond to that question about your definition of fairness?
I can say better than Jody. What I would add is that again, in many developing countries, one issue which should be together with this and with be in some time functional is requires a great change in the fiscal policy and tax policy, which is still typical in Latin America and rest on consumption taxes and make it very the redistributive effect of taxes is very low. Your fairness is to work in trying to rise the situation of very poor, but also to try to tax even more those in the top income, in the top part of the income distribution. I think this is also a challenge facing in Latin America very clearly.
Dominic?
That's another funny one. I'd agree with the Jody and Luis, but I want to distinguish between the process of building fairly and ending up in a fair place, which, I mean, there's the private returns on much of what we're talking about, and then there's a public returns on much of what we're talking about. It's fair for people without children who hope to live in a society that is well financed and can pay for pensions, that we educate our children well, even if they don't, you know, so there's the public good value can spill over in, you know, many different ways. So what concerns me most from this is, put my UNICEF hat on and say it's very, children do not choose where they're born, which families they're born in, which country they're born in. They find themselves places, and on the basis of how governments want to treat adults, whether they think they deserve to be in the situation or they don't deserve to be, however they choose, children are what's collateral damage to some of these actions. And if you're a dependent child, or you're a dependent person or a dependent elderly person, I think that no system should leave you to the will of, you know, just the random chance of where you found yourself. The system should care for these people equally and support the public good. And at this moment in time, there's some countries that do this very well, but there is no country that does it for every child. There's child poverty everywhere. And as we build back, and as we realize that some poverty risks are not down to fecklessness, laziness, you know, they're down to things that people can't control, we should recognize that and introduce policies that address this very unfair situation children find themselves in for no choice of their own.
I agree with that. When I talk to my global health students, I tell them the most important health decision they ever made in their lives was choosing their parents wisely. If you're born to a nice middle-class family in a rich country, you're likely to do relatively well. If you're born to a poor subsistence farming family in a poor country, your life chances are severely limited, and that's grossly unfair. Okay, there's a specific question for Luis. You argued very concisely that there's a lack of coordination was one of the problems of the response to the pandemic. What can be done to improve the lack of coordination?
Well, it's different. It's not just a technical issue. I think it's a political issue. What you need is, because this segmentation of the policies reflect political agreements within the government. Unfortunately, the way to solve it is technically discussed. You don't need to invent anything to try to coordinate. And even though, again, formally there has been advance, there has been social policy cabinet in some countries trying to coordinate formally the work of the different ministries, but they try to share the same type of information. But again, I think it's a political issue. I won't say it's a technical. Well, there are technical issues to be discussed, and there are specific questions you can discuss at the technical level, but it's mainly a question of political willingness to advance in this. And because in each ministry has of its power, of his or her power, if he share a decision with another ministry. And unfortunately, this is, I felt, at least a large part of the problem, the source of a large part of the problem.
Thanks. Jody, there was a question for you about the feasibility of extending sick leave policies, particularly how can it be done in low or middle income countries which may not have a lot of bureaucratic capacity? Is it a highly bureaucratic? Does it need a good functioning bureaucracy in order to achieve a wider coverage of sick leave, if there was the political will to do so?
So I think from seeing that it's already being done in some low-income countries, it makes clear there should be a pathway there. I do think we need to learn much more about how to do it well. There are already across many low-income countries cash transfers. Dominic spoke about the power of cash transfers, but those are very important. Those are not in place of sick leave. But if one can have a mechanism for cash transfers, which many countries do, that reach the people in the informal economy or out of any formal sector job, then we can have mechanisms that reach individuals and families in major illnesses. So we've focused on the pandemic, but it's an economic and life-threatening threat every year to, literally tens of millions of families when someone gets seriously ill. So those are long enough episodes that I think it is realistic across countries to create these mechanisms. They'll look different based on the infrastructure, but we have existing programs that can be built on to make it possible.
There's a lot of questions coming in. One of them is about, of course, is incredibly unfair, the distribution of deaths from the pandemic. What can be done to prevent a future pandemic, and also the huge impact it's had on poor countries and poorer people within even the rich countries? Dominic, do you want to start with that?
Thanks. I think so. I was trying to infer in my early part of the presentation that poverty creates situations where, Jodie talked about it. If you can't look after your health, if you're forced into working in cramped conditions, if you're forced to move your housing further and further into uncharted territory, there are ways, because of poverty and because of inequality, we're driving the risk of further pandemics, both, sort of the risks and the behaviors that follow, because we don't have the systems or the resources to take sort of the appropriate mitigating actions in every case, right? So the best way, the most sustained way, is to address inequality and poverty, I would say. Yeah, I would leave it at that. I love the other questions for Jodie and Luis on. It's incredible to see how many established, some of the West African social insurance systems are 70 years old almost. They've been running systems for 70 years, but just in social insurance for a very small proportion of the population. It's not capacity, perhaps it's will.
I just want to build on what Dominic said and say, I think there are really two key things to preventing it. First and foremost is what Dominic said, which is it's around addressing poverty. I would just broaden that to sustained income, adequate income across work, because work is the most common way, quality work to exit poverty. But when we look at the conditions of spread, and Dave, together with Mary Zhang, has led incredibly important work on this, looking at the ability to socially distance, overcrowding, access to water. All of these conditions associated with poverty make spread more likely and are much more common in low-income countries and in low-income communities. So that's absolutely the first. And the second is we do need to ensure year in, year out, people have access to quality healthcare. So that's healthcare services. There's been a lot of attention on that. And that's things like sick leave that allow you to access that healthcare. So health, getting healthcare and good incomes.
Luis? Do you want to add anything?
Sorry. No much. I totally agree with Jody. The figures on how capita spread in the region is very clear in that respect. And what I have already said, COVID encountered the region with a very weak health system, especially for those attending low-income countries, those informal workers. So it's clear. It's very clear which are the reason of this of such situation. No, I agree with Jody.
I just want to add one last thing amidst the current pandemic, which is high-income countries need to waive their intellectual property to vaccines. Vaccines need to be able to be produced everywhere so that we can rapidly get vaccines to everybody on the planet. It's feasible. We have a mechanism and it's really urgent.
UNICEF and WHO play a leading role in the distribution of, it's not just the vaccines, it's the needles and syringes.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I realize that's just the first step, but it's urgent that we even get past that first step.
Okay, I think we've got time for a final question, which has come back to the coordination, which is basically, are there existing laws and rules which are they sufficient, or do we need something more to get better coordination in order to achieve a fairer post-pandemic world and deliver on the SDGs? Who wants to start?
As I already said, the laws of imposing coordination do exist. It's not a question. Actually, during the pandemic, there was an improvement that the necessity make it more pressing, the need for some coordination. The question here is if would be this experience will be learned for the future, for times where the pressing is less, where the situation is less pressing. No, but there's no one issue. Well, at least in many countries, I repeat, there's not an issue of formal institution, formal mechanism. Things has changed during the pandemic, not just because the law were changes, but there was a more pressing need for working together in order to face this traumatic situation.
I would just add even though we work on laws and policies and think they're an incredibly powerful mechanism, my biggest worry on coordination has been the lack of solidarity. So countries in every single region, and if we had more time, we could call them all out, have looked narrowly at the health of their population as the only thing that is in their self-interest. That's understandable. People are scared. They feel responsibility within their borders, and it is not only inhumane, but it's unwise. It is not the solution. So how we change the vision so that every country, whether it's the US, UK, Italy, South Africa, or Chile, or anybody else who have taken steps, look and see that how healthy their neighbors are matters for humanity and matters for the welfare of their own country.
No, sorry, Dave, I see we're getting close to the end. There's coordination at levels. There's a supranational coordination, and there's coordination within policies in the country. And as Luis says, there's coordination in the delivery of things. And there's the ways for these all to work, and they should work. But there's a great book, and Integrated Services from the OECD 2015. Check it out.
Okay. All right. I'd like to thank Jody, Dominic, and Luis for a fantastic session and a great discussion. I now have the unenviable task of trying to draw some conclusions. But before I show some final set of slides and try and draw some conclusions, I'd like to thank all our speakers, all the chairs of the sessions, the board of the Bristol Poverty Institute, and all the participants who've engaged over the past 3 days. We've had over 250 people. And also I'd like to thank Jorge, who's been taking the visual minutes, and they'll be circulated. But of course, special thanks are due to Lauren Winch, the manager of the Bristol Poverty Institute, and behind the scenes, Sarah Blackmore and Mel Tomlin, who have made this all possible and been working immensely hard. This is our first ever online conference, which has occurred, of course, out of necessity because of the pandemic. And it's been a very steep learning curve, and they've done brilliantly. There are, of course, many advantages to an online conference, not least that we've had speakers and participants from every corner of the globe. We've had people talking from every continent, from Asia, the Americas, Africa, so Europe, and Oceania. It's also been the first conference I've ever managed to attend over 3 days where I've been able to wear my slippers. So it's been much more comfortable from that point of view. Before I show my slides, I'd also like to remind people that the Policy Press is offering a 50% discount on a range of books to all conference participants. So if you haven't already take advantage of that, then please do so. So I'll just share my screen and come to some final slides. Okay, so I'm going to try and draw some conclusions from these past few days. So this is the 6th Peter Townsend Memorial Conference. Professor Peter Townsend was one of Britain's greatest social scientists who sadly died in 2009. He made seminal contributions to a range of important issues: studies of inequalities in health, disability, social care of the elderly, human rights, and domestic and international social policy. But he's probably best known for his lifelong work, which revolutionized both the theory and practice of poverty research. He wasn't just an academic who did academic research. He also was a tireless campaigner to try and improve conditions of the most excluded and vulnerable in society, both in the UK and Europe, but also globally. UNICEF acknowledged his work when he died by paying tribute to him, where they argued that Peter Townsend will be missed by UNICEF, but even more by the millions of poor children around the world who never heard his voice, but for whom he never forgot, either in his research or in his advocacy, more importantly, in his heart. Yet his voice will echo beyond his lifetime and continue to influence efforts to end child poverty in rich and poor countries. And this conference, which is the 6th, we try and hold them every second year, is in tribute and to try and build on his excellent work. If you want to know more about what he did, there are a range of books that give commentary on some of his most important papers. He published thousands of papers. And in fact, there is a 50-page booklet which just lists the papers, which is available for download. He firmly believed that you cannot explain poverty in isolation of the distribution of resources across society, both in the UK and globally. There can be no understanding of poverty in society without studying and understanding the rich. And he continually emphasized that poverty was fundamentally a problem of riches, and argued that profound changes in the structures of power and privilege were needed in order to have a more fair and just society. The institutions which create or disadvantage the poor, and at the same time as they create an advantage to the rich, are the ones which need to be reconstructed if we want to achieve the SDGs and have a fairer world. He was a founding advocate of the relationship between poverty and human rights. And like Peter Townsend, Mary Robinson, who was the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, agreed that extreme poverty is the greatest denial of the exercise of human rights. It prevents people voting and participating in political activity. It prevents the poor's views being listened to and having the things they need for themselves and their children. It denies people the dignity that is meant to be incorporated in the Universal Declaration. Unfortunately, evaluations in my own country of extreme poverty and human rights by the UN Special Rapporteur have shown that in 2019 have shown that although the UK is the world's 5th largest economy, a 5th of the population live in poverty, and this is due to policies of austerity that were introduced in 2010, which have continued more or less until the beginning of the pandemic, although there has been some alleviation during the pandemic. And this has resulted in tragic consequences. Close to 40% of the children are predicted to be living in poverty by 2021, and this was before the pandemic. If the policies which are currently being used to ameliorate some of the worst effects of austerity are not continued, then there will be huge rates of child poverty in the UK and of course across the globe. The bottom line, according to the UN Special Rapporteur, is that much of the glue that held British society together since the Second World War has been deliberately removed and replaced with a harsh and uncaring ethos. A booming economy, high employment, and a budget surplus have not reversed austerity, a policy pursued more by ideological than economic agenda. And many rich countries have seen similar austerity policies, which have had devastating effects on social advancement and economic advancement in countries around the world. Ministers, of course, disagreed with the UN Special Rapporteur's independent assessment, but when Parliament asked Donna Ward, who was the policy director in charge of anti-poverty policy in the Department for Work and Pensions, she argued we did a fact check on the report, and the Special Rapporteur made a lot of good points and was factually correct. And that the UK government ought to take on board what the recommendations were. Of course, we face the crisis, which are not just of social and economic circumstances, but environmental circumstances, which the SDGs are meant to address. As you can see from this graph, although previous crises like the oil crises, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the financial crises have led to small reductions in the amount of carbon dioxide emissions, and the current crisis has also led to a small reduction. Normal service has been rapidly resumed, and the amount of CO2 in terms of thousands of millions of gigatons, thousands of gigatons that are being put into the atmosphere has been steadily increasing since the 1970s. Like the virus, the atmosphere doesn't care about political rhetoric or promises. Only real concrete actions can reverse this trend. So we've had several hundred years of research into poverty. What are the key messages we can draw from it? What do we need to do to reduce poverty and meet the SDGs and build a fairer society? Well, the first message from research is poverty is not a behavior. Poverty is primarily caused by structural factors such as low wages, a lack of jobs, a lack of state provision to adequately compensate those in unpaid work. Despite intensive studies, often by highly partisan researchers, as far as I'm aware, there's no credible scientific studies which show that any significant group of people are poor as a result of their bad behavior, indolence, fecklessness, or skiving. Poverty is not often caused by bad behavior. And policies that aim to reduce poverty by getting the poor to behave differently are not likely to work. If it's seen as a moral issue, it's not. Second important lesson from research is that poverty is a disease. It's not like syphilis, a curse across the generations. You can't catch poverty from your parents. You can't pass it on to your friends, relatives, or children. Research has shown that poor adults and children do not, by and large, have a culture of poverty. They tend to have similar aspirations to the rest of the population. Poor children are, of course, more likely than their richer peers to become poor adults, but this is largely due to structural reasons rather than a cycle of poverty or transmission of poverty. There's been vast amounts of money spent trying to look into transmission of poverty or cycle of poverty. They tend to find that these things really don't exist or are not important. The answer to child poverty is very simple, and it's redistribution. Where there's sufficient resources just redistributed from adults to children, then there's no child poverty. Where there are insufficient resources redistributed from adults to children, then child poverty is inevitable. Children cannot and should not be doing paid work to generate their own resources. This is the job of adults. Children should be spending their time playing and learning, not working in paid labor. Their parents, and if the parents can't afford to do it, their community or governments need to support children around the world so that they're not poor. Child poverty has devastating consequences, and it has long-term economic impacts. Conservative econometric models show that investing in today's children will lead to a much better world in the future. And we know what needs to be done in order to have a child poverty eradication strategy. These are the areas that need to be addressed in order to have a better world and to stop children being poor. I won't go through all of them, but we need to increase the incomes of poor families and children and ensure as far as possible children living in low-income families are not materially and socially deprived. We know what are effective and efficient anti-poverty measures. And we know that we need progressive taxation and incomes policies that redistribute some money from the rich to the poor and from men and to women, and also redistribute income across people's life courses, so they're not poor when they're children and not poor when they're too old to work. We know that active labour market interventions to create high quality jobs, to enforce minimum standards of wages and working conditions for the low paid within international frameworks are effective policies for building a fairer and better world. We know that universal social insurance and public social services are crucial importance. The basic needs services that can be introduced by internationally agreed minimum levels of benefits, such as International Labour Convention number 202 concerning universal social protection floors, are crucial to building a better and fairer world. Not just all governments, but all employees, employers, organisations and all trade union federations have agreed to universal social protection floors. And one of the major aims we need to get from the post-pandemic world is for this agreement to be put into concrete action. There also needs to be greater accountability and increased social and democratic control over transnational corporations and international agencies to remedy the democratic deficit. We can't go on having transnational corporations avoiding tax by moving monies from one country to another and playing off the tax regime of one country to another. And recent initiatives by the US government and the OECD are crucially important to building a better and fairer world. I'll leave you with those thoughts. Are there any questions that people would like to have? Otherwise, I'll draw the conference to the close. Okay, any last comments from our speakers?
Just to say thank you very much, Dave, and everybody. I've enjoyed every part of the conference I've been to. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank everybody. I wish you a good weekend and particularly a good May Day. I said about the policy press, if you want to go to policy press, then you can have the 50% off the range of books on that are relevant to the discussions that have occurred. And I'd like to thank everybody for their fantastic contribution over the past 3 days. Thank you very much and goodbye. And I look forward to seeing you again, hopefully in person at some point in the future. Bye-bye.